So after hearing about Aristotle's take on different genres in the last video, you might be wondering, what are the categories of contemporary political address? Because I'm sure as heck not going to go to the Agora anytime soon. And here's a list of some of the ones that Jasinski pointed out. So we have the eulogy, which Campbell and Jamieson wrote about, the apologia, the acceptance speech, concession speech, inaugural address, and then I've added declaration of war because we had a little discussion about that in class. I want to ask you what you think if these are all ceremonial. I would argue, yes, all of these are trying to adjust how people feel about a current event, and they aren't necessarily asking for a particular plan of action from those whom the speech addresses. So in terms of a eulogy, that's Spock's funeral over there on the right. From Campbell and Jamieson, we learned that a eulogy is the kind of speech that one gives at a funeral or otherwise to a community who has been affected by death. We are unfortunately experiencing many eulogies today, and I think you can note the different parts of the speaking DNA, like the blueprint for speaking, that people rely on in this very dark kind of time. So usually a eulogy will try to alter the way that people feel about the deceased and the living. It changes our relationship and ceremonially marks that although we no longer have this person in our lives on a day-to-day basis in the way that we can speak to them, nevertheless they are important to us in memory. So a eulogy will acknowledge death, and it will also try to bring together all of the people who are gathered to grieve the person who is no longer with us. Eulogies are intended to heal the damage that's been done to the community by the very big loss of a person's life. Often eulogies will use metaphors of rebirth. They'll acknowledge that the deceased survives in memory, and they'll talk about the living carrying on the deeds or other good works or virtues of the person who's no longer with us. Apologia is a little bit different. This is the kind of speech that someone gives to apologize for something, or at least to address some sort of accusation of wrongdoing in the past. So apology speeches aren't always genuine apologies. And I think you probably know that based on just being a person in the world. Not every apology is a real apology, but these are addresses that deal with accusations of wrongdoing. A self-defense speech is another way to look at it. So there are 4 strategies. I didn't do it. I'm a good person. What I did isn't as bad as other stuff that other people have done. And what I did was appropriate, but you need to look at it a different way. So there are the 4 strategies: denial, bolstering, differentiation, and transcendence. And I think this category is pretty fascinating and does exist pretty visibly in pop culture. There are acceptance speeches, which we're also quite familiar with. So this is the kind of speech that someone gives when they receive an award. We understand this genre. You're supposed to keep your remarks brief. You're supposed to be gracious. You're supposed to acknowledge the people who organized the event and also the people who helped you get where you were, the people who helped you succeed. You may seek to establish a personal connection with the audience through storytelling. And there may be some commentary on the organization's goals. Sometimes we note that celebrities turn this towards the political. Audiences disagree about whether or not this is an appropriate use of the genre. The concession speech, meanwhile, is the kind of thing that you give when you haven't won something that you're fighting for. So those of you who watched the Mitt Romney documentary, maybe you'll recall the way that Romney discussed what to say in his concession speech with his children. So usually it's expected that you'll thank your supporters, you'll compliment the victor, you may revisit the parts of your campaign that you thought were important, and nevertheless pave the way towards unification between those who were on the winning side and those who were on the losing side. So it's very important to be gracious here and to unite the people who were just moments ago competing for the same thing. Inaugural address has a similar function, as does the acceptance speech for the president. Unification of the collective is highly important in many kinds of ceremonial speeches. So in the inaugural address, unify the nation and mark them as members of the people, maybe using civil religion. comment on shared values and the tradition from which those values spring. So particularly on the right, we might hear this as a reference to founding fathers. Explain the current problems and principles, so set a course, do some agenda setting. This might be familiar from Medhurst. And tell people your plan of action. And then finally, this is the one I've thrown in because we discussed this vis-a-vis President Trump's declaration of some sort of fight against the coronavirus, which is not exactly a declaration of war, but the other fun thing about genre is that you can cross-read things as other genres to see how that might put things in a different light. So in a declaration of war speech, we might traditionally see a definition of good and evil. We, the people, are on the winning side. Some other thing, some entity over there, or those people are our antagonists. That's part of a declaration of war speech. There will be an emphasis on solidarity and collective values. Who's fighting and what are we fighting for? And there might be some kind of idealization of the post-war lifestyle. So we are fighting today so that tomorrow our children can, yada, yada, yada. It doesn't really matter what. Something positive that gives people a boost as they're looking towards a time of trial and tribulation. So in closing on this brief rundown of genre, I'm offering a few proposed rules of political communication that you can take or leave as you look towards the final paper for the class. I would say audiences have set expectations for certain kinds of speaking events. So speakers need to meet their audiences where their expectations are and either do a solid job of delivering what audiences want or surpass their expectations. Speakers can artfully use the norms that genres have, and almost all of the speaking engagements that we see politicians engage in running up to elections do have pretty formal traditions, a pretty long track record, so we know in many ways what to expect of certain speaking events. However, situations change. A global pandemic might change what we expect of a speaker in a certain event, and so on. But speakers can apply generic norms or diverge from them, but if they completely fail to meet any of the generic expectations, then the speech may be judged a failure. Finally, stump speeches, debates, political ads, and all of these other kinds of communication that we see politicians engage in the wild do have generic constraints, and speakers need to be aware of them. So in your analysis of different politicians and their efforts this year, you can say, well, I think that this person is meeting generic constraints better than this other person is, and for that reason, they're following the rules of political communication better. So that could be part of your argument in your final paper. Finally, here's my Works Cited page, and you can access lots of different links and other resources and examples to types of speeches when you go and review these slides on Moodle. Hope you're all doing well, and I'll talk to you again soon.